Hi, everyone. My name is Crystal Newby, and I'm the Senior Associate Director of Education and Training here at NACAC, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar, How Technology is Transforming High-Stakes Testing and International Student Enrollment. There are increasing concerns about the accessibility and security of admissions testing for international students. Coupled with 3 years of consecutive decreases in new international student enrollment, universities are seeking new strategies to support international recruitment and admissions. Today, you will learn more about how admission offices have tackled these challenges and how the Duolingo English Test provides an accessible, secure, and insightful tool for international admission. So at this point, I'm going to do less talking and turn it over to our presenters. So Jeff Toussaint, the floor is now yours.
Amazing. Thank you, Crystal. Thanks everybody for being here. My name is Jeff. I'm a marketing manager with Duolingo. I come from the educational technology industry, and I've been with Duolingo and the Duolingo English Test for the last 3 years, so almost since the beginning. I'm joined by two wonderful co-hosts who are also experts in their respective fields. I'll hand it over to Jen to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jennifer Dewar. I work at the Duolingo English Test. I'm starting my 3rd year with the Duolingo English Test, and I come from a college admissions background. Prior to joining Duolingo a couple of years ago, I was working in the admissions office at Washington University in St. Louis. Prior to that, I spent 13 years in the admissions office at Duke University in North Carolina, and prior to that, I started my career in the admissions office at Connecticut College. At all 3 institutions, I worked in international admissions, and I'm excited to talk a little bit about how those experiences working in admissions brought me to Duolingo a little bit later in the presentation.
Awesome. Thanks, Jen. And Jeff, do you want to say hello?
Sure. Thanks, Jeff. Hi, I'm Jeff LaFleur. I've been with Duolingo for a year now, and prior to joining Duolingo, I was an assistant professor in the Second Language Studies Department at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And I have previous experience prior to that as the director of assessment at the Center for ESL in the University of Kentucky. And I did my PhD in applied linguistics with a specialty in language assessment at Northern Arizona University.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so we're going to be talking about testing and technology. High stakes testing is not always everyone's favorite topic, but with the right application of technology, it can really serve as a bridge for students and really a source of insight for admissions offices. And we hope to cover quite a bit about that today. International education is really going through a dynamic time, and we want to talk about what we're seeing in the industry, what trends. We'll cover some foundations about the Duolingo English Test for those that are unfamiliar. For those that are more acquainted, we will go under the hood, looking at all the technology that goes into the test, how it works in the field, and then we'll save time for questions. So let me hand it over to Jen to talk about international education in 2020.
Okay, well, thanks, Jeff. Let's take a look at the next slide and talk a little bit about international education. And what I'm going to do is sort of lay the foundation. This is very much a former admissions officer perspective on international education and sort of a former admissions officer perspective on the need for more technology to change how students are applying to universities. And after that, I'll hand it back over to Jeff, both Jeffs, in fact. And I think they'll really be getting into the nitty gritty. And many of this is going to be stuff you already know, okay? As a review, you know that in the past few years, we've seen a decrease in enrollment after enjoying an enormous increase in enrollment for the past 2 decades at international student enrollment. And this is at US universities specifically. So one of the things we didn't ask in polls is if we have folks from non-US universities, and I think we may. So just know right now I'm talking about changes in international student enrollment at US universities specifically. And since 2016, we have seen a decrease for 3 years in a row. And if we take a look at the next slide and try to understand what's going on with those trends, there are a lot of factors that are driving international student mobility and the change in enrollment trends in the United States. Certainly some of that has to do with the high cost of attending university in the United States. The political climate cannot be discounted. Concerns about safety in the United States are real for international students. And also the appeal of universities outside of the United States, places like Canada, the Netherlands, Australia. Those universities have been recruiting very they've been recruiting very, very much in the past decade or so also for international students. And so US universities are really competing with those countries for international students. But I think one thing, and from my perspective, and when I worked in college admissions and traveled all over the world, that really was impressed upon me was just how complex it is to apply to US universities. It is, and I don't have any empirical evidence of this, but I feel really comfortable saying, after hearing school counselors tell me this time and time again, it is the most complex system to navigate in terms of submitting an undergraduate application for admission in the world. And if we want to pop on over to the next slide, one of those complexities is what's required for testing for international students. US universities tend to require a lot more standardized testing beyond just a high school curriculum that would often suffice within a home country or within other countries as well. And some of that testing, I think, has been really challenging for students over the past few years. There's been issues related to security in testing, some of those very high-profile issues. There's been concerns about bias in testing and how outcomes in testing can be tied to things like socioeconomic status and income. And most recently, there's been real concerns about how public health crises can make testing inaccessible for students. Even just this week, following the news out of China with the efforts to contain the spread of the coronavirus and how test centers have been shut down nationwide for the month of February. And so let's move on to the next slide, Jeff. We've heard professional organizations like NACAC, like International ACAC, which is the international affiliate of NACAC, ask for members to show forbearance and flexibility to international students over the year. Most recently, NACAC issuing this statement in October of 2019 related to test cancellations in Egypt and Hong Kong. But beyond just the sort of physical inaccessibility sometimes of tests, I also want to talk a little bit about the costs of standardized tests for US admissions. And I think one of the most powerful ways to frame these costs is to understand what they feel like for somebody who is paying for these tests in non-US dollar currency. And so the sort of relative cost, which is sort of an economic principle called the purchasing power parity. And what we did, the Duolingo English Test team, is we took a look at the costs of traditional English language test center delivered tests. And most of them cost around $200 US. It varies a little bit country by country and test by test, but that gives you a very good average. And what $200 US means for a student in Brazil, the equivalent is $614. For a student in India, it's the equivalent of $1,300. And really, stunningly, for a student in a place like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, it's over $11,000. For that family, it would mean a family in the United States the equivalent of spending $11,000 on a standardized test. And so these tests cost a lot of money. They are a huge investment that families have to make in their children's futures. And so it's really important to talk about cost of tests and how the cost of tests can be brought down, how test costs can be decreased. And I'll talk more about that. Another thing related to costs is accessing tests. And this is something that I think if you live in a major world city, you may take for granted, but in fact, test center coverage throughout the world is not terribly broad. We took a look at test centers for all of the three major providers of test center-based English language proficiency tests, and there's one test center per almost 2 million people in the world. If you think about that on the flip side and think about internet users and who has access to the internet, it's still not worldwide coverage, access to the internet. You can see sub-Saharan Africa doesn't have very strong internet access, but there is one internet user per 2.2 people. And so we'll look at one more slide, I think, that illustrates this really well, and that's Brazil. There are cities in Brazil that are over 1 million people that don't have a single test center. More than 14 hours away is the closest test center. And I think that it's important to keep that in mind as there is so much dynamism, there's so much changing about international student enrollment right now. And as those demographics shift, many schools are thinking about how to broaden, how to deepen their prospect pools, their applicant pools, and realizing that in many very large cities in the world, there's no access to a test center. And so we sort of took those principles at Duolingo and applied them to English testing, but that's something that we had been doing for quite some time with language learning. So it was a familiar concept that you could take something and you could put it on the internet and you could deliver it via the internet, and just by doing that you could lower barriers, and we've been really successful at doing that at Duolingo. Most people know us for our very popular language learning app. With over 300 million users, we teach over 35 different languages for free. And a few years ago, some of our users started asking us if we'd certify their English. It was interesting because we had never sort of thought that we would become a test provider at Duolingo. We were really focused on teaching languages and not assessing languages, but we were asked to assess. And when we took a look at all the barriers that are up for students all over the world and the high costs, we realized there was a real need for testing to become more affordable and more accessible. And we felt like, as the world's sort of leading provider of language learning, we were in a unique position to be able to develop a new test and to use our technology to develop a new test that would be more affordable and more accessible. And Jeff, let's look at the next slide. This has really been a project that's driven by Duolingo's founder, Luis von Ahn. Luis himself was an international student who came to the United States in the late 90s from Guatemala. When Luis applied to US universities for undergraduate study, he in fact had to fly to El Salvador to take his English language proficiency test. And so, many years later, 15 years later, when he was hearing about how hard it was for students to access these tests, how expensive they were, how test centers were closed, it was a very familiar narrative for him because it was his own. And so that's when we decided we were going to go and create the Duolingo English test. And before I hand it over to Jeff to talk about the nuts and bolts of the test, we're just going to show you one more slide to give you just a sense of before the Duolingo English test arrived as an option for students in the summer of 2016. This is primarily what students were using to apply to university, and these were their options. This is how much it cost. This is how many locations there were worldwide, how long these tests took, the turnaround time, and then also associated costs for sharing results. So there can be a real expense for sharing results. So I'll talk with y'all a little bit more at the end of the webinar, but I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Jeff Tousignant. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, let's cover some of the foundations of the test, because there are some that are completely new to the Duolingo English test and some that are less familiar before we kind of take a deeper dive. We've said the word access and accessibility a lot of times, and so that's really the biggest difference between the Duolingo English test and other test center administered English tests. So this test is available online on demand. So there's no travel to a test center. Students don't have to make appointments in advance. They take the test online from their computer whenever they're ready. The test only costs $49. They can send their results to an unlimited number of schools. And if you're an institution that wants to accept results, it's completely free. There's no contract or obligation. Another difference is that in addition to a proficiency score like you'd receive with other tests, the Duolingo English test also offers two other signals of English proficiency, and that is a short video interview and a writing sample that gets shared with the institution alongside the score. So you'll get a number which highly correlates with other tests like the TOEFL and IELTS, and there'll be concordance that we can share with that. But you also get to see and hear the student speaking and writing in their own words in a test environment. So it's them, and that's how they communicate organically. So this is helpful to get to know candidates better, to make more informed decisions about borderline candidates. And there's really a lot of different applications for the results of this test. Overall, the entire experience is very fast. For students, it only takes about an hour, although that's a little bit variable, and Dr. Jeff LaFleur will talk about that in a moment. Students can receive the results in 48 hours and then kind of share them instantly with an unlimited number of schools. So obviously this is appealing to students, but also for admissions offices, especially around this time of year when you're trying to take action on apps. You can get a result, an English proficiency result for a student within 2 days. So around deadlines, around important decisions, this is really valuable. And of course, no high stakes test would exist unless you could trust the results. And so two aspects of the test that needed to be our foundation, especially because this is a test that's administered in a different way, is the security of the test and also the accuracy of the test. We'll dive into each of these more later, but security, this is the number one question we get about the test. If students are taking it online from home, how do we know that they're not getting help from outside resources, whether another student or notes or their phone? And there's a lot of technology that goes into this, but on a high level, their entire test experience is recorded via their webcam, their screen, their keyboard, their microphone, their mouse movements. We record the entire test experience, and then we review it in multiple ways. We use artificial intelligence and computer vision to kind of automatically identify suspicious behavior. And then we have remote human proctors, multiple rounds that will watch every test session to certify the student is who they say they are and that they're not getting help from anything. We'll talk more about this, but the combination of these different technologies and these different methods is really reliable in certifying each individual test session. And then accuracy. Accuracy is a really broad notion, and in the English testing community or language testing, people talk about it in a different way. They look at reliability and validity. Really, is the test able to produce consistent results, and does it measure proficiency on a construct that is understood and accepted by the use case, which is most commonly for us and the population on this webinar, university admissions. And all the research to date really supports this and shows that in many ways we're as good, if not better, than the other tests available. If we zoom out to kind of the testing landscape, Duolingo's managed to make improvements on each one of these pillars of the test experience. And so this is really kind of leading the way in terms of accessibility and reliability in English testing in 2020. So that's kind of the background of the test. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jeff LaFleur to talk about the technology that goes into the test. And I will say this, we could have a week-long webinar just on the technology because it is really so fascinating and there's so much that goes into it. But we'll be looking at just kind of 4 components about how technology is used to develop the test items, to administer the test, to score the test, and to make it secure. So I'll let Jeff take it away from here.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Thanks for introducing my set of slides too. Do you want to move on to the next one? And we'll just jump right into how we develop the test items. So the scores of the Duolingo English test are tied to the Common European Framework of Reference. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's a set of 6 levels that describe what people can do with a language in a variety of situations. So for example, in the lower third there in the beginning level, you might expect someone to be able to make greetings and describe their likes and dislikes, where in the intermediate levels there, you'd expect people to understand abstract texts and maybe use a little bit more complicated vocabulary, right? And now the way we tied our test to the Common European Framework of Reference is where the technology really comes in. And so I'm going to talk about 2 of the item types in tandem here. We asked people who had graduate level training. Most of these people were pursuing their PhDs or had already been awarded their PhDs in applied linguistics to annotate bodies of text and word lists. And so what they did was they would read the text or look at the words and assign them to different levels of the CEFR, like A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, or C2. And then after the experts had assigned those levels to the text and the word lists, we taught the computer what the characteristics of the vocabulary words and what the characteristics of the passages were at those 6 different levels. And then what that allowed us to do was grab a bunch of natural English language sources, such as other vocabulary words and other texts that hadn't been assigned levels, and then run them through the algorithm and place them on our CEFR aligned scale, which creates a large item pool for the computer adaptive administration, which is an important aspect of a computer adaptive test, is having a large item pool for security reasons and exposure reasons. In order to make sure that the algorithms were doing what they were supposed to do, we confirmed this by comparing the expert judgments after the model was run with the machine learning predictions for the vocabulary and the text, and we see high rates of agreement, 0.90 for the agreement between experts and the vocabulary model, and 0.76 with the agreement between experts and the passage model. And so this shows us that the machine learning algorithms did a good job of placing the text and the vocabulary words across the separate scale. And this high-level overview that you just got is described in detail in a forthcoming publication, The Transactions in Applied Computational Linguistics, and that should be out in the February issue. As we've hinted at already, the test is computer adaptive, and what this does is it ensures that every test session is unique. No test taker, there's not like a form A, a form B, and a form C. Each test taker will see a different test, so to speak, when they sit down and take it. And this is possible because we have this large item pool from which to draw upon so that test takers do not come across the same items, either if they take the test repeatedly over time or if they're sitting next to a friend taking the test. And of course, we monitor the item exposure and then retire items as they are exposed, as they are seen by more and more people. And in a second here, I'm going to dive into what the computer adaptive test looks like. So what you're looking at here on this slide are 3 different test sessions. Starting on the left, you see a person who received a total score of 50. In the middle, a person who received a score of 120. And on the right, a person who received a score of 145. All right. Along the x-axis of each of those plots are the number of questions that were administered to the test takers. And then the y-axis is, of course, the score. The orange lines in these plots represent the difficulty, along that y-axis, they represent the difficulty level of the items that were administered to each of the test takers. And then the green trace represents the estimated ability level of the test taker at that point in time. And so what you see, there is no green trace for the first 5 items or so, and that's because that's called the burn-in phase. And so every test taker receives a set of 5 or 6 items drawn from the same difficulty buckets. And after those first 5 items, then the computer makes a provisional estimate of the test taker's ability and then gives them an item that will challenge them at that ability level. So as you can see in that first plot, the tip top of that orange line in the first plot, the computer decided to really challenge the test taker, and the test taker got it wrong. And then you see that downward slope of the line, and the computer threw the test taker an easier item last time around. This slide shows our exposure rates. Okay, so with a cat, it's important to have a large item pool because you don't want the computer to give different test takers the same items or the same test taker the same items over repeated administrations. And there are 2 ways of measuring this. One is called the item exposure rate, and this is the percent of tests that use a given item. And our item exposure rate is under 1%, which is quite lower than other published computer adaptive tests where you can see the GREs is at 14%. And the next measure is the exam overlap rate. And this is a measure of the percent of items that are shared between any 2 test administrations. And again, the percent of items that are shared between any 2 test administrations that have been given over time is under 1% as well. And we have not been able to find any other high stakes computer adaptive tests that share this measure. And so one takeaway from those 2 slides is that it would take about over 1,000 repeated tests for a student to see the same question, or about 41 years because you can only take the test once every 30 days.
One other thing I'll just add on about computer adaptive testing, or CAT as Jeff likes to refer to it, is that this also allows for the test to be a lot shorter. So standardized tests tend to be 3 or 4 hours, but that's because each student is answering questions that might not pertain to their ability. With an adaptive test, the question difficulty changes dynamically throughout the test, and therefore can reach a result that's as accurate in a fraction of the time. And so that's a better experience for the student, but without sacrificing the reliability of the scores.
And so now we're going to move into some of the technology behind how we score the test. And as you may or may not know, we use automated scoring to score the speaking and writing. On the left, you see what the machine looks at. It looks at grammatical accuracy, grammatical complexity, lexical sophistication, and diversity. So lexical sophistication can be thought of as like rarer words or more infrequent words are more sophisticated, and more frequent words are less sophisticated. Lexical diversity is a test taker that uses a wider variety of words and a response has a higher lexical diversity score. The computer also looks at task relevance and then features related to length, and then on the speaking side of things, acoustics and rate of speech. Now, to confirm that the automated scoring algorithms are doing a good job of measuring people's spoken and written language proficiency, we compared the scores of the algorithms to scores that people gave them. And what you see here is the relationship between the machine scored algorithm and the human scored samples for the writing prompts. And we've got a few measures up here. Cohen's kappa is a rate of agreement that factors out chance. So this is agreement not due to chance. And then Pearson's R is your traditional correlation coefficient. And so the agreement between people and our computer algorithm, the machine agreement, is 0.79, which is quite high for a Cohen's kappa, and then a Pearson's R of 0.81. And this was done on a large sample as well. And so where the speaking prompts each have more than 3,000 observations. And for the speaking prompts, it's much of the same story. The human machine agreement for the Cohen's kappa is 0.82, and the Pearson's R, the correlation, is 0.80. So we are very confident that our machines are doing a good job, or our machine scoring algorithms are doing a good job of rating the speaking and writing samples as an expert would. Okay, so the next step, another question people often ask is, well, what is the relationship between scores on the Duolingo English test and scores on other, similar high stakes tests? And so our relationship between the Duolingo English test and IELTS is 0.77.
I think so. For some reason, when this turned into a PDF, the number disappeared from the slide, but it's a higher correlation, suffice it to say.
Well, this is in the tech manual, which is shared. I'm pretty sure DET IELTS is 0.77 and DET TOEFL is 0.78, or vice versa.
DET IELTS is 0.78, Jeff.
Vice versa. I apologize. And we're also working with a similar sample size in terms of shared tests. Okay, and as Jeff hinted at earlier, each and every test goes through a robust certification process. And what you see here is the pipeline from test upload to the end point where a certification decision is made. The first step is that the performance goes through an AI review, which puts flags on the performance for suspicious behavior. It goes through 2 rounds of human proctoring. So each test session is watched twice by independent people, and they can leverage those AI flags to investigate any suspicious behavior during the test session. And if needed, the test session can get escalated to a third proctor before a certification decision is made. And we do all this in a 48-hour time period. Part of the AI is using data forensics such as face detection and ID verification, voice recognition, keep track of the keystrokes that people use when they are responding to prompts, as well as looking at their eyes and then watching for lip syncing. And one benefit to this type of administration where a person is in their room taking the test alone is the proctor to test taker ratio. So instead of having one proctor for every 25 test takers where the proctor's eyes can only be on so many people at once, we have a 2-to-1 ratio with 2 proctors to every test taker, and there's no contact or interaction between our proctors and the test takers.
Thanks, Jeff. That was a lot of information in a short amount of time. Where should people read more about each of these things if they want to kind of dive deeper?
Yeah, that's a great question. All of this stuff has a deeper dive in the technical manual, as well as on other documentation on the englishtest.duolingo.com/research website.
So now we kind of understand the test, how it works, why it's reliable and secure. Maybe we'll look into how schools are using it in practice as part of their admissions processes. And let's hand it back to Jen to kind of take us home there.
Oh, thank you, both the Jeffs. And Dr. Jeff LaFleur, you did a good job getting through those slides. They had some substantial content on them, and I think we're in good shape timing-wise and have plenty of time for questions. So we were a little worried we were going to have too much content. So I'm glad to see that we've kept pace. And I do hope you will download the technical manual, which is available in the handout section of the GoToWebinar app. Also on our website, we're going to have our email addresses down at the bottom of the last slide, and so you can reach out to us directly as well. We're glad to hear from you and can go over this in more detail if you need that. So a little bit more before we open it up for questions, just about how the test is being used, who's taking the test. I'm really proud to share with you that to date, students in 170 countries have taken the Duolingo English test. So certainly in countries where there are no test centers, places where I've traveled in sub-Saharan Africa, where students would have in the past had to have gotten on maybe a 12-hour bus ride to go to the neighboring country, have been able to take the Duolingo English test, and hearing some of their stories about how transformative that experience was for them and the kinds of doors it opened for them is something that sort of really inspires us to keep pushing for this, because we do think it's really important in lowering barriers and sort of changing what it means to be able to access a standardized test and to access higher education. We've had a lot of support from primarily US universities. Duolingo itself is located in the United States. We're located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And because we're located in the United States, our first sort of effort has been with US universities before, working with universities outside of the United States. There's a lot of universities in the US alone, almost 4,000. And we have more than 500 of those schools that are using the Duolingo English test in some way, shape, or form. You can see from this list, we have everything from public flagship universities, some of which get tens of thousands of international applicants a year, to small liberal arts colleges, to some of the most selective research universities in the United States. And I think that the variety in the kinds of institutions that are using the test really speaks to the sort of nimbleness and usefulness of the test in admissions processes, even though those processes may be very different. Some schools are not selective at all, some schools are highly selective, and they're finding ways to use that test. So let's talk a little bit about some of the use cases for the test. I mean, certainly many universities are using the test as an equivalent to a test like a TOEFL or a test like an IELTS, and so students can submit, if they choose, the Duolingo English test. But also we see schools that have been pretty proactive in being able to complete applications with the Duolingo English test. So finding that, it's February 14th and they have 300 international students who are missing some part of their application. And this is one of the things that they can complete quickly and be able to then have an application fulfilled and be reviewed and considered for admission. Borderline candidates are a popular way to use the Duolingo English test to get more information about the student. I think in particular, selective universities have appreciated the interview portion of the test in being able to sort of elicit more qualitative aspects of various candidates. A number of institutions have been excited about the Duolingo English test because it has helped them reach more markets. It has helped them expand in countries where we have a pretty good footprint with the Duolingo English test that have not been traditionally well served by test centers. Places like Brazil, Nigeria, Indonesia are very well represented among Duolingo English test takers, including Mexico as well, but haven't traditionally been the kinds of places where you'll see a high density of test center locations. We see this has really been happening this week. The Duolingo English test being an option in cases where other tests have been canceled. We've never had the Duolingo English test canceled because it's always available. It's online. It's on demand, as Jeff explained so well. And so that's not sort of the possibility of how we deliver the test. It's never canceled, so we're always available for students as an option in the case of a test cancellation. And then finally, this was something that the universities that we're working with taught us, but it's turned out to be a very useful tool in athletic recruitment for coaches who are working on recruiting international students. It gives them a very quick read on their English ability. It allows for coaches and admissions offices to communicate more quickly with officially recruited athletes becoming students who are admitted to those universities. And so those are just some of the ways that the test is being used. I also want to take a look at the next slide because this is something that we're really proud of. It's very much aligned aligned to the mission of Duolingo, which overall is to make education more accessible to people all over the world. And we do that with our language learning app that's free. But it's also important for us to the test itself is affordable, so it is more accessible than the traditional English language proficiency test at the $49 price point. But for many students, we looked at that purchasing power parity slide. For many students, even $49 represents a significant portion of their family's monthly income. And we do not want a financial hardship to be a barrier for a student. And so we do have a fee waiver program. We are, I believe, the only major test provider that offers fee waivers to international students in a formalized way. Students who or counselors can request fee waivers for students through our Access program on this website. You can hop on that website and take a look at the kinds of questions we ask counselors. You can watch the video of our founder, which is pretty compelling if you'd like to take a look at that. We also distribute fee waivers to many of the universities that recognize the Duolingo English test that they can give to applicants as well. So I think we've done pretty well with timing. And so I'm going to hand it back over to Crystal, who I believe is going to do some moderation of Q&A. Thank you all so much.
Yes, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Jeff and Jeff. We do have a question right now, so feel free to ask more questions because we do have a little bit of time to answer your questions. But our first question from one of our attendees is in regards to cost. The question is, does it cost anything for an institution to start using the Duolingo English test?
Oh, Crystal, that's a great question. I'll respond to this one because it's an easy question. I'm going to leave hard questions for the Jeffs. No, it does not cost anything for an institution to accept the Duolingo English test. So it's like accepting any other kind of test. You don't pay to accept SATs or ACTs. The cost is borne upon the test taker. So it doesn't cost anything. And if you're an institution that wants to start receiving the Duolingo English test, you see my email address. You can send me an email right after this webinar and let me know, and I will get one of our team members to contact you, and we can set you up to receive Duolingo English test results within a few minutes. We do need to give you credentials to log into our secure dashboard that we will create for you so that you are receiving results directly from us. And so that's important to clarify. If you want to be a receiving institution, we recommend that institutions don't just accept emails from students of test results. And in those emails, you wouldn't be able to watch the video interview anyway, but that's not a very secure way of accepting test results. We want you to receive those results directly from us. So you do need to let us know and we'll give you login credentials. We also integrate with Technolution Slate through an API. It's really simple. It's turnkey. It'll take your Slate team about 15 minutes. So if you do read applications on Slate, we would be happy to give you that information as well.
Great, Jennifer. Thank you so much. Oh, now the questions are coming in. Okay, everybody is joining us. Lots of questions coming in. I hope they're hard,
except for the Jeffs.
They may be. You all might have to fight it out. The next question that we have is in regards to proficiency. And is there like a minimum score that shows language proficiency? Are you all able to share that information, or is it kind of a case-by-case basis? What do you recommend?
Good question, Crystal. I'll take this one, Jeff, even though you're more qualified to answer, but the harder ones I'm gonna pass to you. So we report English proficiency on a scale out of 160 points in 5-point increments. That also corresponds to the Common European Framework of Reference, which is a framework of language proficiency. So on our website, we'll send this as a follow-up email, but it's englishtest.duolingo.com/scores. It will kind of walk through each of the score ranges and what that means in terms of descriptors, in terms of how a student can function in the language. It will also include concordance with other major tests like TOEFL and IELTS. So that's how it's reported. In terms of the proficiency levels themselves, that's usually up to the accepting institution that's making a decision for admissions or placement or progress measurement.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. And so we still have a few more questions. I'm trying to get to some hard ones so we can have Dr. LaFleur answer them. But this next question, one of our participants works in a graduate school, and they have a very rigorous structure set in place in regards to their application process. And so they were wondering if you all have any pointers on how to get buy-in for accepting Duolingo English test results at the graduate school level.
That's a great question. And we have been working with some graduate schools. I understand where that question is coming from, because graduate school admission tends to be more, for lack of a better term, balkanized than undergraduate admission. Undergraduate admission is usually sort of more insular. There's one office, there's a decision maker who can then sort of push it forward, whereas there's lots of stakeholders in graduate school admissions. We are happy to work with your school and to work with your team and to give you information that you need to get buy-in. Sometimes it's a matter of us doing a video conference call similar to this, where there's several of us from Duolingo who meet with stakeholders on your campus, and we're happy to do that. And so feel free to send me an email and we can talk a little bit about that. But that tends to be what's most effective, is just helping everyone understand what the test is about, what's the technology that's driving the test, how the test relates to tests that people are familiar with, like TOEFL and IELTS. I don't know if either of the Jeffs have anything to add.
I think that's a good place to start.
I agree.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. The next question is in regards to students being able to share their scores. The first half of the question is there a fee that is affiliated with student shares or sharing their scores? And also, is there a cap on how many universities in which students can share their scores?
So no, there's no fee to send results. It's unlimited. No, there's not a cap as far as I'm aware. And I have spent the last few weeks getting to meet students that are now at university that have taken the Duolingo English test. And a few of them actually have applied to 30 schools, because that is the maximum number that the Common App allows. But with other tests, it can be prohibitive if you're spending $19 or $20 to send each of the results. So that is a huge appeal to a test taker.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jeff. This next question is in regards to students who may not have access to really strong internet connection. If there's a student in a region who really has poor internet access or connection and cannot finish a test due to, an internet blackout or an electrical blackout or anything like that, any interruption, how does it work? Is the student able to go back to where they started, or would they have to start a new test? What's kind of the protocol there for students in that situation?
Right, and that does happen in some parts of the world. The internet is less stable. We have done a lot of work with school counselors and also counselors at community-based and non-governmental organizations, and sort of spreading the word about how to have a successful Duolingo English test experience, and making sure in places where there isn't a stable internet connection that you've tested your internet speed, that you wire in. That makes often for a much more successful or chance of success at being able to upload a session. But we are able to have successful test sessions all over the world. I myself tested the Duolingo English test and took the test from a really rural location in sub-Saharan Africa. And it was a little bit slower uploading, but it uploaded just fine. And so that's something that we've worked really hard to make sure happens. And we're fortunate to have all of the sort of power of the language learning app behind us if we need sort of engineering support to make sure that the test is working. I will say, if the test shuts down, if you're not able to upload it while you're taking the test, if suddenly the power goes out, something happens, lightning strike close by, we allow for students to restart the test for free within 30 days. So we will send them a coupon automatically that says, your test session wasn't successful, but it wasn't your fault, and you weren't acting maliciously, and so you can restart the test in 30 days and take it again. You do have to restart the test, though, because of security reasons.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you for that response. I hope that clears things up for our audience member who asked that question. Unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for our webinar today, but I have to thank Jennifer and Jeff for really spending the time today to talk about their test service and really providing their thoughtful comments and expertise. So thank you so much. And last but not least, I really want to thank you all, our participants today, for joining this webinar. We always really appreciate your participation.